Welcome back, my dear listeners. This is a new episode of The History of the American Mafia, a podcast written by Fabio Fabiano and brought to podcast in English by Grace Cartlisi. I do hope you enjoy today's new episode. This is part 5 of a series on Lucky Luciano. Being free in Italy was obviously much better than being in prison in New York, so Lucky Luciano moved to Naples in February 1946. His stay, however, was relatively short. In fact, he decided to live there after a short visit to his hometown, Leccara Friddi in Sicily, escorted by the police. Despite his return had been welcomed triumphantly by the people of Leccara, he chose Naples. 8 months later, Lucky attempted to circumvent his expulsion, escaping to Cuba. A reporter from the Havana Post in early 1947 recognized Luciano while he was leaving a club in the Cuban capital in the company of a good-looking young woman. Lucky had arrived in Cuba from Sicily on September the 29th in 1946 without much fanfare. He made a stopover in Brazil, and on his arrival he met up with his faithful friend Meyer Lansky. They were invited to dinner as distinguished guests at the home of the Minister of Agriculture, German Alvarez Fuentes. In the 1930s, Luciano and his acolytes had already started there several illicit activities, all managed by the mafia. Prostitution, casinos, and drug trafficking for a turnover of hundreds of millions of dollars. In 1933, thanks to Meyer Lansky's connections, Luciano was authorized by Cuban President Fulgencio Batista to organize legal gambling activities in the Cuban capital. From this agreement, the Grand Casino of the Hotel Nacional and other gaming houses were born. For the permission granted to him, the mafia paid Batista $3 million every year. Havana became the ideal place for the boss to restart his illegal activities while waiting for the right time to return to the States and resume command of his family. In Havana, Lucky Luciano stayed at the Hotel Nacional, room 724, overlooking the Malecon, the 6-lane road that ran along the seaside. Between the 22nd and 26th of December 1946, at the Hotel Nacional, Lucky Luciano, during his stay in Cuba, organized a summit of mafia bosses, including those who were part of his families, such as Albert Anastasia, Frank Costello, Joe Adonis, Meyer Lansky, and Vito Genovese. Singer and actor Frank Sinatra was also there to entertain the mafiosi. The Hotel Nacional was practically closed to the public. 500 guests arrived representing the most powerful mafia families in the United States. Also present were Giuseppe Joe Bonanno, Tom Lucchese, Willie Moretti, Tony Accardi, the Fischetti brothers, all relatives of Al Capone, and Santo Trafficante, a very powerful mafia boss from Florida. The American government, thanks to investigations conducted by the Anti-Narcotics Agency, discovered Luciano's plan and his project to find new ways to export narcotics to the United States. At that point, the American administration began to put pressure on the mafia boss to return once again to Italy. Initially, the Cuban authorities turned a blind eye, but then when the American government threatened to suspend the import of medicines, the Cubans were convinced and changed their minds. On February the 23rd, 1947, Luciano was arrested at the El Carmelo restaurant and taken to a base defined as an unwanted foreigner. No charges were filed against him. Thanks to the appeal presented by the boss's lawyer, the execution of the measure was postponed by almost a month. On March the 19th, 1947, Luciano boarded the Turkish steamer Bakir, bound for Italy, thus ending for Lucky Luciano his dream to return to the USA. From that moment onwards, and probably at the insistence of the United States, Lucky was kept under close surveillance. In truth, despite being exiled in Italy, Luciano continued to operate in the illegal drug racket. It is assumed that he transported large quantities of drugs hidden in dolls that children played with. Lucky had never been a monogamous person and preferred to have many short-term, often very short-term, girlfriends, but in Italy he met Igea Lissoni, a woman 20 years younger than him. Some historians claim that they later married, others deny. In any case, Igea adored Lucky and the feeling was evidently reciprocated. They lived together in her home in Naples until her death from breast cancer in 1952. They never had children. "I didn't want to give birth to a child who would live his life as the son of Luciano the gangster," the boss declared in an interview. By all accounts, Lucky was truly homesick for America and was always kind to American tourists. Lucky used to give autographs to anyone who asked for them, but in America, some of Lucky's associates began to get irritated because they were sending him so much money to Italy without receiving anything in return. Therefore, they reduced the sums they were sending him, and the boss, however, continued to live a luxury life. Without Luciano, his former second lieutenants Vito Genovese and Carlo Gambino seized power and even killed many men loyal to Luciano. In 1957, he was succeeded by Vito Genovese, who gave his name to the Luciano crime family. That same year, Lucky summoned a meeting of both Italian and American mafiosi in Palermo. Those present at the famous Hotel delle Palme in Palermo determined the conditions. The Sicilian Cosa Nostra, already involved in smuggling cigarettes throughout the Mediterranean, was the ideal partner to collect the refined heroin in southern France and ship it to the USA. The American mafiosis looked down on the Sicilian bosses as they realized their differences, which eventually caused a split between them. The American mafia members had entered alternative criminal activities such as prostitution and usury, and had advanced on the social level, approving fundamental changes, as for example they were in favor of divorce. At the time, these aspects contrasted with the original values of Cosa Nostra. Following that meeting, due to a change in the political scene in Cuba and the arrival of Fidel Castro, restoring the relationship between the American and the Sicilian bosses became fundamental in order to continue their drug trafficking activities. Lucky suffered a substantial drop in income in 1959 when Mafia's best friend Fulgencio Batista fled Cuba following the revolution and Fidel Castro took over. Fidel, originally not so much a communist as an anti-American, closed the casinos and expelled the mafiosi. For Lucky, that was a huge problem. In Cuba was the most important route for shipping heroin to America. Lucky Luciano, like other mafia protagonists, was attracted to Hollywood and had contacted an American producer proposing to make a film about his life. This made his associates in America not very happy. Making a film about the mafia at that time was like violating the code of silence. The mafia bosses threatened him in an attempt to dissuade him from his intentions. Lucky, however, was not intimidated and went along with the project. It is said that at the Capodichino airport in Naples, shortly before a meeting with the producer, someone had poisoned him. This, however, was unlikely, since Lucky, who had long suffered from heart and blood pressure problems, died of a heart attack. Today, almost everyone agrees that the cause of his death was in fact a serious heart attack. Lucky was, after all, an avid chain smoker, and shortly before his 64th birthday, he was hospitalized for heart problems. When Lucky died, some newspapers wrote that he would soon be arrested for a $150 million drug racket. Luciano's remains were brought back to the United States to be buried. His funeral was attended by thousands of people ready to pay homage to the man who had invented the American organized crime as we know it today. According to his wishes, Lucky Luciano was buried in the family tomb in St. John's Cemetery in Queens, New York. On his tombstone, the name Salvatore Lucania was placed, that same name he was given at birth.